The reason why we're doing this series is because of this simple fact, that 23% of North American adults today consider themselves religiously unaffiliated, which means they do not believe that God and faith is a worthwhile pursuit. They have abandoned faith altogether. And that number among millennials is 35% of millennials believe that. And because of my doctoral research, I know that over 40% of Generation Z, those who were born in 1996 after, don't believe in God or do not believe that faith is a worthwhile endeavor. And all of that should make us lean in a little bit. If you're a parent, it should make you lean in a little bit because it means that your children are growing up in an environment where God seems less and less and less valuable and important and less necessary. And if you're a person who has a pulse, you should care about this, especially if you're a follower of Jesus, because the people you work with, the people you hang out with, the people that are serving on your PTA, the people that are spending time with your kids, your very kids, whatever situation you're in, this is the reality. And it begs this question, doesn't it? Who needs God? And today my goal isn't to convince you that you do. My goal is simply to lay out before all of us that if we make the decision to say that we no longer need God, if you choose to believe that God is no longer important, that faith is a failed scientific experiment, as Sam Harris would put it, that a step away from faith is a step towards something else. You should write this down in your notes. It's really important. A step away from faith is a step toward something else. That you cannot be Switzerland. That to choose to believe that faith does not exist, that God is not real, is to begin to believe a series of complex beliefs that are the result. And here's what I know about atheism, what we're going to talk about today, is that atheism has gotten a bad rap, right? Because atheism was like in the 70s and the 80s, the guys that played Led Zeppelin, like, the records backwards, and they were saying all these cryptic, scary things, right? That's what we thought it was. But that's not the new atheism today. The new atheism today is marked by writers like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, brilliant minds. These are people that I like to read. If you were to walk into my bedroom, you'd see on my nightstand books like God is Not Great and The God Delusion and The End of Faith. 3 books, right? And you might be thinking, my gosh, that's what my pastor reads? Isn't that encouraging, right? Like that might be what you're thinking at this moment. But I am just mesmerized by the perspective of the new atheism. And I want you to hear this, that the alternative to faith, the step away from faith is a step towards something. And that step towards something is atheism. And atheism is a complex set of beliefs that simply lead to some unsettling conclusions. And what I want to do today is scare you a little bit if you're considering walking away from faith, to step into a new worldview, because this is what the smart people who believe and write and are the spokespeople for atheism say atheism is. And for those of us who believe but wonder, or believe and have relationships with people who don't, I want us to be able to be equipped to have actual conversations that move beyond the Bible says it, I believe it, and that confirms it. Because we live in a day where your fact-based questions cannot be adequately answered by faith-based answers. We are beyond that today. There is too much to know and too much that is known for us to simply say that is enough. So you need to be equipped and you need to be ready to engage your teenagers and engage your friends and engage your family in a rational, logical conversation about this question: who needs God? So can we talk about atheism for a little bit? You ready to do that? Great, let's do it. Atheism comes to some unsettling conclusions, and I want to walk through 3 of them with you. The first one is this, is that no God means no you. Would you just say that on the count of 3 because it just sounds so depressing? Ready? 1, 2, 3. No God means no you. No God means no you. And here's what that means. It means, in the words of Sam Harris, who wrote in his book Free Will, that the self is an illusion. That what you believe is you really isn't you. That you are simply a mixture of chemistry, biology, and physics wrapped up together. That your brain is simply a series of electric impulses that are going off, neurons that are firing, and all of those things were wired to happen and to take place. And there is no you at all. You is a figment of your imagination. You are nothing more than biology, chemistry, and physics. And that might be right. That might be right. But I don't think that we're convinced that that is the case. Christopher Hitchens writes in a book called Mortality. He's one of the kind of foremost voices, right, or was one of the foremost voices on the new atheism. Writes in a book Mortality as he's dying. He died from complications of esophageal cancer in, I think, 2012. Writes in his book Mortality, kind of documenting each day, this statement that when I saw it just blew my mind. He's reflecting on his life, and the doctors keep on telling him, Dr. Hitchens, your body is. Dr. Hitchens, your body is fighting. Dr. Hitchens, your body is responding to. Dr. Hitchens, your body is trying to deal with. And at some point, he got so frustrated with the medical community that was taking care of him that he said this, and it just blows my mind when he says it. He says, I don't have a body. I am a body. Here are the implications of that. It means that if we believe that there is no God, that means that there is no you, that everything has been predetermined as a result of biology and the laws of physics, meaning you have never, ever made a choice. That the idea that you love someone is all a figment of your imagination. That the idea that you decided to put on jeans today instead of those cute capris, the reason why you made that decision is not because you made the decision, but because you were wired to do it anyway. But that gets a little bit nerve-wracking, doesn't it? Because let's be honest. Do we think that it's okay for a teenage kid to walk into a school and begin to let round after round after round after round after round go off, taking innocent life? Do any of us believe that that's okay? We don't, right? But this posture and this perspective, this unsettling conclusion about atheism, which is the conclusion that all of the new atheists, all of the smart people, I've read their books, I've listened to them online, I've watched way too many of these YouTube videos and clips and debates. It's just like, just sucked into the black hole. They all agree in this idea that everything is determined, everything has already occurred, and there's no way you can make another choice, meaning that we ought not have any concern, pain, or worry about what happens to the people around us because it was meant to happen that way anyway, so why even care? Here's the unsettling conclusion I want you to write down in your notes. That every choice you've made is an illusion, and there is no you, just a combination of biology, chemistry, and physics. But here's what I find so interesting about the new atheists, is that as they're making this argument and propagating this belief, Stephen Hawking, I think, puts it so well when he says this, that I have noticed that even people who claim that everything is determined already and that we can do nothing to change it, still look before they cross the road. Because here's the deal. An unsettling conclusion of stepping away from faith is that there's no God means no you. But you know that you don't believe that. You know that you don't experience life that way. You know that you don't think that every choice you've ever made wasn't a choice, it was already predetermined. That every feeling you've ever had as a feeling was predetermined. You don't believe that. You believe that there's a little bit more to you than simply electronic impulses firing off and neurons working in the brain. But if that first one isn't concerning enough for us, I think the second one is probably even maybe the most concerning, is that no God means no justice. So I want to give you a definition for justice. Justice assumes that there's a standard of right and wrong and a standard for good and evil. And that standard is determined by the fact that people have inherent value. In the version of new atheism, when we think about what it means to believe that there is no God, there is no way for us to actually have justice. Because justice is determined by the person who decides what is just. Which means that I can walk into your house, punch you in the face, and feel like I am justified to do it. And you can punch me back or choose not to punch me back. And your version of justice is your version of justice, and my version of justice is my version of justice, and that's going to work just fine. Except that's not the way the world works, right? Like, imagine if we tried to live this way, that my version of justice is the only version of justice that matters. right? And because I'm biology, it doesn't matter what I do to other biology. It means that if a 14-year-old girl is sold into slavery, it does not matter, and we should not care because it was meant to happen anyway, and survival of the fittest is what matters most. If a child is born with some things that we don't like or some things we wish we didn't have, surely we can just make sure that the child no longer exists and take their life because it does not matter. But do you believe that? We don't. Because we live in a world that says my truth is my truth and your truth is your truth, right? Which works until my truth bumps up against your truth and one of our truths hurts the other person. And then we want justice, don't we? But if there is nothing outside of me to appeal to when it comes to justice, then justice is an illusion. It is a joke. And you never ought to feel offended. You never ought to feel hurt. You never ought to grieve. You never ought to feel terrible. You never ought to say, remember 9/11, because guess what? Terrorists choosing to fly planes into buildings is simply a predetermined, unavoidable act that in some way, shape, or form was necessary by nature to get rid of a certain group of people. It means that the Holocaust has no moral value on that. That we can't say the Holocaust was wrong, and we can't say that genocide was wrong because it was simply nature's way of letting the fittest survive. But we don't believe that. But a step away from faith is a step towards something. A step away from faith is a step towards atheism because faith believes that there is something outside of me. And stepping away from that means that there is nothing outside of me. And if there is nothing outside of me, then all me is what matters, which means that the concept of justice in this way, this unsettling conclusion I want to make here, is that the only standard for good then is whatever it takes for our species to strengthen and maintain its place in the animal kingdom, which means if I take your life because I am stronger than you, I am justified in doing so. But no one believes that. You know who doesn't believe that? Are the new atheists. So one of the things I find really interesting as I've read these books is that Richard Dawkins in particular, he writes in The God Delusion, and he writes another book called Out of Eden that we'll talk about in just a second. He is a major proponent of the idea that really we are nothing more than simply neurons that are firing off electrical impulses and a combination of physics, chemistry, and biology, which means that there is no value to human beings because human beings are simply designed to propagate DNA. That is what we are for, and we are part of a storyline that we did not start, a storyline that we will not end, and it does not matter where we fit in the middle of it because all of this is happening whether we like it or not. And yet, I want to read to you a quote from Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, when he talks about the problem with religion, just so we can see the tension that these guys must feel as they're writing these things. So he's going to talk about religion here, and he's going to say that religion is the problem. And this is what he says, that religion is an insult, now listen to this next phrase, to human dignity. Do you see the problem with that? If we do not have value, there is no such thing as human dignity. Yet religion is an insult to it. But it gets better. He says, with or without it, you'd have, listen to this, good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, it takes religion. Do we see the problem with that? Who determines good? And who determines evil? If Richard Dawkins' version of good is his version of good, it may not be my version of good. His version of good may be my version of evil, and when my version of evil meets with his version of good, we have a problem, and there will be no justice. And if you believe that there is no God, you have to agree with the sentiment that there is therefore no justice, which means the word ought not be a part of our vocabulary, because no one ought to feel anything because it doesn't matter. But the problem with this perspective, right, is that if all we are is biology, and biology can do what we want to do whenever we want to do it, if you live that way long enough, right, you will be locked up by other biology. And you will lose the freedom that you apparently never had in the first place. So no God means no you. And no God means no justice, because there is no standard upon which we can see there to be justice. Which leads to the third point I want to make today. That no God means no meaning. That every single time you felt love, you did feel love. That the work that you do, it doesn't matter. That the way that you raise your kids, it doesn't matter. That the way that you choose to experience and engage with the world doesn't matter at all, because all of this was predetermined in the first place. In his book, Out of Eden, he says this, Richard Dawkins: nature's not cruel, it's only pitilessly indifferent. It's indifferent. This is one of the hardest lessons for humans to learn. We cannot admit that things might be neither good nor evil. Now stop. Didn't Richard Dawkins just say a couple of statements earlier that there is good and evil, right? Are you tracking with me? Okay, I just want us to see that tension, right? In Out of Eden, he says that we cannot determine what good and evil is. And then a few years later, the same writer is saying that there are aspects of which we can determine what human dignity is, and that there is good and that there is evil. Do you see the problem that we're laying out? Yes? Okay, good. I just want to make sure I'm not so nerdy that I'm the only one who thinks about this. All right, now, that nature is neither cruel nor kind, but simply callous, indifferent to all suffering, lacking all purposes. He continues by saying this: we are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. This is exactly what we are for. We are machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. So here's the unsettling conclusion. If you take a step away from faith and you step towards what is the only other option, to believe that there is no God, to believe that there is no God means that there is no meaning. This is all an accident. You have no value, and neither do the people that you love, neither do your kids, neither do your grandkids. You have no purpose, and none of this matters because there is no you anyway. You are simply a machine designed to propagate future machines. Which means your marriage is fiction, because we are designed to propagate our DNA, which means that if a husband or a wife cheats, they're justified to do it. It means that your kids really aren't the most important folks, because if their lives are taken, their lives were meant to be taken anyway. And all that time you spend trying to create an environment for them to thrive is a waste. It means that things like the Holocaust or genocide are inevitabilities that we ought not lose any sleep over. But we don't believe that, do we? We don't. There's something about that doesn't connect with us. But a step away from faith is a step toward that perspective. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of my favorite people to listen to. He's an astrophysicist, and he really is just a brilliant mind. And he doesn't believe in the Christian God, but he does consider himself to be agnostic, which means he has some form of faith, But Neil deGrasse Tyson, in an interview I listened to recently, said, one of the reasons why you cannot divorce science from faith is the fact that of the scientists that are in North America, over 40% of them ascribe to faith. Now, you may not hear that or may not know that, right? But I think it's important for us to understand is that this idea that science and faith are mutually exclusive is a logical fallacy. It's not true. And the reason why we know that it's not true is because they're asking two different questions. Science asks the question, what and how? And religion and philosophy ask the question, why? It is apples and oranges. And Francis Collins, who is one of the most respected scientists in the world, he leads the Human Genome Project. Have you ever heard of that? Francis Collins is a Christian. And Francis Collins is an incredible scientist. And I love it when how he describes the role of science. I love how he describes this idea of meaning and why we cannot simply look to science for the answer of why, because science does not even ask the question why. This is what he says. And this is probably what you resonate with a little bit more than you resonate with everything I've been talking about. If a man is drowning, even if I don't know how to swim very well, I feel this urge that the right thing to do is to try and save that person. Evolution would tell me exactly the opposite. Preserve your DNA. Who cares about the guy that's drowning? But that's not what we see when we see and hear news about 14-year-old girls being abducted, is it? That's not what we think about when we sit and we reflect on the atrocities of World War II or the atrocities of the Stalin era or the fact that there are more slaves today than there ever has been in the history of humanity. Our initial response is not, well, I guess they were weak and the strong survive. When we see a person who's in need or we see a child who's been battered and abused, our first inclination is not to say, too bad, so sad, guess I'm the lucky one. And why is that? I think the reason why we feel that way is because of something that an ancient philosopher wrote a long, long time ago, thousands of years ago. I think the reason why we believe that there's a me in here somewhere, the reason why we believe that the concept of justice can actually be found, it's a worthwhile pursuit and endeavor. The reason why we believe that life does have meaning and it is not meaningless, and what I do matters, and how I love matters, and who I love matters, and the way in which I spend my time matters, might be because while science answers the questions of what and how, it cannot answer the question why. And maybe the words of this ancient philosopher, a man by the name of King Solomon, who would pen these words in a book, a journal, that's condensed in this thing called the Bible, which is loaded with a bunch of questions that we'll talk about in the next couple of weeks. But inside of that, he lays out this posture and this perspective that I think we all need to consider. He said, yet God has made everything beautiful in its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. Could it be that you believe that there's a you inside of you because God has imprinted you with him? And you believe there's a you inside of you because there's a God who has made you? Could it be that the reason why you believe that there's justice that ought to be pursued is because there is somebody outside of time and space who is perfect, who is the determining point on what is right and what is wrong and what is good and what is evil, and maybe that might be God? Could it be the reason why you feel like there's meaning and that there ought to be purpose and value to what you do, and there's ways that you ought to treat people and ways that you ought not to treat people, is because this being that we cannot see, this force that's behind all of it, we'll call it God for today, has designed you to believe that and to give you skills and talents and abilities and a mind to bring meaning and purpose and value to the world? Could it be that we do not understand the whole scope of all that this Creator has done, and the reason why we have things like science and history and medicine is because he's equipping us with the skills and abilities to answer the questions what and how. And like Francis Collins says, as we look into the digital elegance of DNA, we find that something, someone must have made it. And could it be that the person or the someone that made it made you and made justice and made meaning? And the reason why you feel those things is because maybe you were made to feel them. A step away from faith. Step away from faith is a step toward something else. And that something else is a world where there is no you, there is no meaning, and there is no justice. But let's be honest, that isn't appealing. And the reason why you walked away from faith, or why your son walked away from faith, or why your best friend walked away from faith, or why your uncle walked away from faith, has nothing to do with those things, does it? But it has everything to do with relationships that communicated a version of God that was fake. It has to do with religious rules that seemed impossible to keep, and the people that told you should keep them never kept them in the first place. It has to do with rituals that we grew up with, that as we got older seemed to be ridiculous. It's because we grew up to become adults, and adult questions did not find their answers in the childhood faith that we grew up with. So what I want to do is I want to invite you back to next week as we continue in one sermon over the next couple of weeks, where we'll talk about why it is that people, why maybe you, left in the first place. And I might say that the God you left was a God worth leaving, because that may not be the actual God. So we'll talk about next week.